So you're asking yourself, I don't know much about the significant events, the wars, the cultural shift. I don't know much about the history in general. That's why I'm taking this class. That's why I'm reading this book. So, what you can do is that your book has, before each age, these very nifty summaries of the age. And so, the things you can look at are, of course, right there in front of you. And you can ask yourself, what ideas are being talked about? In other words, what things seem to be important in this very quick summary? And then you can, after you completely understand it, because like if you look at this, here we're talking about humans first evolved. So we're talking about the first humans. I already mentioned earlier that we see this one has the largest sort of time grouping, right? 300,000 years ago. We're still talking about the BCE when we're talking about the ancient world. And we see words like farming, first towns, civilization. And so you can kind of gather, these are the important things of this era, right? Then you can look at the very next one. Here we have the medieval one. And here we have a much smaller time gap, right? 1,000 years between the 5th and 15th centuries. And as my question says here, see what changed. So now we're talking about a fractured empire, new Islamic empire. So we're seeing new religions being introduced. Like I said, read through these just very quickly. They're not that long. And try to see about what seems to be important for each age and what changes between each age. What countries are being talked about? What continents are being talked about? What are no longer being talked about in that next one? What seems to be the more important facts of it? And don't just stop there. When you're trying to identify like what causes shifts or what exactly makes up that era, these timelines are extremely valuable in understanding because it sort of puts it into, I would say, perspective. It puts it into view. I mentioned earlier about Justinian the First, and you can go through and just kind of briefly read about the things that happened and see where this one ends. And by looking at where it starts and where it ends, you can pick up a lot of information about what defined that era, right? Because this is what they're saying, specifically this is for the medieval timeline, that the Ming Dynasty is where they sort of placed the end of this era. So look at the next timeline and see what the start of it is, and see if you can figure out what made that change, what shifted from the end of this era to the beginning based on just those few historical events that you could glance at from these timelines. And I think that would provide a really good perspective on how to see what shifted between each of these ages. And, we already got our next question. Yes. Okay, so why even divide it into the different ages? Why don't we just, it's all history and study it that way? It's a good question. Why do we divide history into the ages? And I just so happen to have here a great way of explaining it. So the first thing is that it helps us to organize and understand, right? So what I mean by that is, I mentioned earlier that our brains automatically try to put things in chronological order. What that means is in order of how they happened, when they happened, from the earliest, or the latest, to the most recent. And history is that same way. If we tried to study history year by year by year by year by year, it would be too overwhelming. As I mentioned, the ancient world starts 300,000 years ago. Studying it year by year by year, even if we had records dating back that far, would be so overwhelming that we would never be able to really reach present day, as we are constantly every day creating more history, right? So by organizing it into these groups, this was when the ancient world happened, this was when the medieval world happened, this was the age of exploration, it helps us to easier, for lack of a better word, digest, to break down the information that's given to us. And by grouping them together, by saying it seems like these civilizations kind of had a very similar push toward progress, right? It helps us to actually do the next two on here, which is the first, compare and contrast. So again, compare and contrast just means we're looking at what's similar and what's different. And we can do that between the ages, what's similar and what's different between the age of exploration and the age of revolution. But we can also do it within the age itself, because it's not perfect the way that it's divided. For example, during the medieval time, we have very contrasting, very different things happening in the East and in the West. In the East, China is experiencing its golden age. In the West, we have a lot of sort of repression, sort of pushing down of the sciences and a real focus on religion. And there's lots of hardships. I mentioned earlier, the Black Plague happens during that time. And even still, they both happened during the same time frame, during the same few hundred years, right? And so looking at this information and grouping them together helps us to understand how the different cultures evolved during these times, and how, as we all moved toward the modern era, evolved together to start sharing the connections. Because like I said, the modern world is going to show that things that countries do start affecting global. They have a global impact. And then as well as another, providing context. It's important to know in history if when the Romans were having trouble, if they could have enlisted Viking warriors to help them fight. Why didn't they enlist Viking warriors? And in truth, it's because the Vikings didn't rise to power until the Romans were actually fractured into their east and west counterparts. The Roman Empire was at its weakest when the Vikings were at their strongest. So they wouldn't have really had much to do with each other during the time that it would have been important for Romans to want foreign soldiers, I suppose. But understanding that, why is a knight not riding a dinosaur to storm the castles in England during the medieval, helps us paint a true picture of our history, because we know what can happen, what could have happened, and what did happen. And that's context. So these three things are the whole reason why we need to divide history. First, it makes it easier to understand because it's organized. It makes it, number two, easier to compare what's similar, what's differences, and what we can learn from that. And three, it provides context. How can we know what could have happened and what did happen during certain times? Lastly, I said we would talk about the three significant contributions, or three important contributions of the ancient world. Now, what I have here is going to be more of these vague or non-specific ideas. And when you really think about it, you should try to write in a more specific way, excluding maybe the first one, which is arguably an extremely important part of the ancient world, and that's going to be agriculture. Agriculture is just a fancy word for farming, and I don't know if I even need to tell you how important this is to society at this time and even today, but let's discuss it a little bit. Because of farming, we were able to have extra food. We didn't have to spend so much energy and time moving around, and with that extra food, we were able to stay in one place. We were able to save that food for long winters, survive better, Because of that, we also started trading our extra stuff with the extra stuff of other people, which created a barter system, which then led to us having money. So it has this very long line of contributions that are still important to us today. Next, something to think about. Remember, early civilizations are well known for their religions. We're all very familiar with some of the oldest ones from ancient Egypt, including some that were from Mesopotamia. Maybe you've heard of Gilgamesh and his stories, but then we also have ones like the ancient Greeks, and Christianity would have just started towards the end of the ancient world. And all of those things impact us today, whether they're just in stories or whether you're religious and you go to church. They have their roots in this civilization era, this age. Then next, of course, we have science. Science began in the early ancient world in a few different ways. We had mathematics and geometry, which were studied by ancient civilizations in order to build buildings and structures like we see with the ancient Egyptians, we see with the ancient Greeks, and they really started to develop and form at these times into the ones that we study today. Then another one you might consider is going to be law and order. We see the first set of written laws and the first verbally spoken laws, I guess is the best way to put it. During this time, laws formed in the ancient world, and those laws were easy to understand. Like with the Code of Hammurabi, the first written laws, we have the idea that if something bad happens to me, then something bad should happen to you if you were the one who caused it. And these early forms of law and justice lead to the systems that we have today, where we are penalized, where we are fined if we do something wrong, something that goes against society. And so because of that, we're able to finally start to build a society that is peaceful. Then next we've got language and writing. These are very important for some obvious reasons. We need language and writing as a form to communicate. It's a way for us to cooperate. We wouldn't be able to have a society if it wasn't for our ability to talk with each other. And specifically because of writing, we can now share knowledge unedited that survives beyond a single generation. Whereas before, you would just have knowledge passed down, and hopefully that knowledge would then get passed down to the next generation by the previous generation. Your dad would tell you, you would tell your children would tell your children, but that would be unreliable. And so writing and reading as well, this sort of language, allowed us to pass this knowledge down to not just those we spoke with, but anybody who was able to get a hold of and read the language that's written. And finally, we have art and academia. Now, art is a form in which we can express what we're thinking without words, and possibly even express what we're feeling. And this goes from the earliest form of cave paintings that we found, to pottery, to actual paintings and sculptures that we see in early civilizations. It all started in the ancient world. And so if you feel that art is something that is important in our world today, then you might consider that to be a contribution, as well as if you think that education is an important thing that we have today. Our first schools, our first academies were founded in ancient Greece by Plato. And in there, we learned philosophy, and it was continued on to divide into different subjects of science and mathematics, which kind of goes a little bit along with what we talked about earlier with sciences being developed in the ancient world. But academia would be specifically if you think that education is one of the three most important things. And so, yeah, when you are thinking about your writing for the ancient world, you can sort of pick maybe more specific things from these 6 ideas or some of your own. There's still lots of things we didn't talk about. There's certain tools. There's the idea of being able to utilize fire that you could use. So really think about it. Look through your book, explore some of these ideas, and really ask yourself what things are talked about that we still use, that still have value or important to us today. All right, well, that is all the time we have today. So before we go, I just want to leave you with this quote by an Italian novelist, Luigi Pirandello, which is, "The history of mankind is the history of ideas." And with that, I will see you all next time.